Okay, I think we will start now. Thank you everyone for joining us to this session. Let me introduce Jared Sheehan. He's the CEO of PwrdBy. He started PwrdBy in 2015 after leaving Deloitte Consulting, where he was a senior consultant in their supply chain, sustainability practice, and worked with clients such as Tom Shoes, Starwood Hotels, and Panasonic. Jared is a Lean Six Sigma black belt and has built numerous successful data-driven products in partnership with clients, including Children's Miracle Networks hospitals, fundraising application, in-flight, which helps manage 75K plus corporate partners and raise 400 millions annually. Jared is the creator of the Amelia and Neon Moves mobile apps, both of which leverage machine learning technology. Jared is also the author of The State of AI in the Nonprofit Sector. The second edition will be launched next month. Thank you, Jared, for joining us. This session is yours.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here and excited to have so many folks in the meeting to be able to chat about this. So I'll just dive right into it. So as you mentioned, CEO of PwrdBy, I built a number of AI-based applications, web and mobile, done a number of different algorithms, things like that. Figured I would just start off with a fun little quote about artificial intelligence and the future of artificial intelligence, in that everything we do in the future could be some version of artificial intelligence, because so much of DataCon LA is about thinking about where artificial intelligence can go and all of the incredible things that are happening. And what's really interesting about the nonprofit sector is that in some ways the nonprofit sector is more advanced as it's discussing AI, and in a lot of ways it's very nascent in how it's thinking about AI. And we'll explore both of those concepts as we walk through all the information that we're going to show here. So just real quickly, give a little bit of background. We're going to talk about what is the state of AI in the nonprofit sector, how people think about AI in the nonprofit sector. We'll talk about current state of things that are happening here. We'll talk about investment trends, and then we'll just briefly touch on the future of AI related to nonprofit and leave a little bit of time for questions and those sort of things. So, with that, I'll get going. So what's happening in nonprofit? Well, the answer is that quite a bit is happening in nonprofit. All of these articles or headlines or organizations that I'm showing here have had major things happen to them in the last year. We've seen a lot of things related to AI tracking COVID. We've seen AI struggling with things like GPA tracking. We've seen AI following animals in the rainforest, tracking orca whales, people coming up with ways to be able to rethink frameworks for AI, using AI to be able to identify emissions and think through ways to stop child predators. And a lot of these things are in partnership between nonprofit organizations and technology providers of various kinds. And so there's just a lot of interesting things that are happening in the AI sector, and it's worth having a report specifically focused on what's happening in the AI space. So we started the State of AI sector last year, so this is our second year that we'll be publishing it, actually next month. So the perception component is going to be specifically focused on the data that we had coming from 2019. So it's a little bit dated, but we're going to have some updates of what's going on in the sector as well. And the way that we did the nonprofit perception survey is we did a survey online of 212 practitioners that was focused on the diffusion of innovation theory as a common sociological communications theory. And then we did a meta-analysis, and we did an AI investment analysis, and finally we did a future perspective overview, which I would say is a bit of a social prediction approach. And we mapped all these together in a 35-page report that you're able to go online and download. You can either do it on our website, PwrdBy.com, or you can do it a few other places as well. And in there, we learned some really fascinating things about AI in the nonprofit sector. And so the first piece of this is, what do nonprofit professionals think about AI? What are their feelings about it? Are they getting the effects of it? Are they adopting it? Those sort of questions. So first of all, let's think through the approach. So our approach is diffusion of innovation theory. And the diffusion of innovation theory essentially is a theory that says, how does a new innovation spread throughout society? So when the internet came about, what percentage of the population adopted it at what stage over a time period? And so the survey questions and where an innovation is are essentially a series of survey-based questions that you can ask individuals to determine where they are in a population. And what you can do with that is then understand where that individual is essentially in their decision-making process. Do they have knowledge of what's happening? Do they have a decision perspective or framework that they've thought about? Have they made a decision to use it, yes or no? And then if they have used it, have they identified value creation from that? And along those steps, you're able to figure out all the different components of what goes into making a new innovation, such as AI, able to be distributed throughout a population. So that's just a little bit of background. The survey itself, you'll see that it's skewed more heavily to the innovator. And, we actually really enjoy this piece of information last year because what we felt was that the responses from last year, since we have so many folks that had identified as early adopters and innovators, it actually made it so that our report was probably a year ahead of where it actually was. And as we're doing the research this year, this information has more evenly distributed across the various parts of the different types of innovators and early adopters and categories. So what we're seeing is that last year's report was a little bit ahead of its time, and this year is probably going to be right on time in terms of the data that's coming out. So what sort of nonprofits were involved as well? So we had a number of different nonprofits and roles within those nonprofits. So a lot of fundraisers and partnership folks. We had a lot of program managers, a significant number of senior leaders, a number of developers, data managers, VPs of IT, and then a number of marketing and communication folks, and then a number of other involved individuals along that process as well. So it was a good distribution of different nonprofit roles, as well as it was a good distribution of information related to the number of years that they've worked in nonprofits. So we had a nice, fairly appropriate bell curve of basically showing that we had people anywhere between less than 1 year to over 20 years of nonprofit work and experience to be able to respond to the survey. So as I mentioned, there are 5 stages of the diffusion of innovation theory. Those are knowledge, persuasion, decision, implementation, and confirmation. And what we looked for in each of these is to understand where people were learning about artificial intelligence, what attitude formation they were coming into with that, what decision were they making? This is the hardest step. This is the yes, I'm going to do this, or no, I'm not going to do this. And then how are they actually doing it once they decided to make that decision? And then finally, what is the reinforcement of the positive outcomes? And so we mapped each of those into a series of questions, again, based on the diffusion of innovation theory. And from there, we were able to come up with some really interesting results. So first of all, knowledge. Most nonprofits learn about artificial intelligence from their CRM providers. And this was pretty consistent across different innovators types and categories. It tweaked a little bit. Innovators were more likely to hear it from other service providers, whereas the majority of other categories of innovators heard it from CRMs. So CRMs are a bit of a gatekeeper in the nonprofit sector. And most nonprofits, their lifeblood runs on a CRM product of some sort. So it's maybe not a huge surprise for some folks, but it becomes that channel component for a lot of nonprofit professionals to basically hear of new technology trends such as AI from their CRM provider. Second of all, who did they hear from specifically, either in their organization or outside of it? And this one's probably no surprise for anyone, but technology champions. So if you're really excited about artificial intelligence and researching it, there's probably a number of other folks in your organization who have never heard about it or just learning about it. And so oftentimes that nonprofit individuals are learning about it from technology champions around them or in their world. So moving on to the persuasion side of it, overall, AI generally met people's values. So, we look at this from a agree to strongly agree perspective, where we're seeing, over 70% of people felt that AI met their current and existing values and needs. And only a very small percentage actually disagreed with that information, which was surprising to us. We actually expected less people to do that. And as we're starting to gather the data in 2020, we're actually starting to see a shift of that, is that AI does not align with people's values as much as it used to. And I think you think about some of the trends that are happening in the world today related to bias and some of those sort of things, and that actually makes sense to us. So why do people use AI? And two major reasons, and this is consistent in 2019 and 2020 data, is organizational efficiency and fulfilling our mission. So specifically focused on how do we do more with less, whether that's fundraising efficiency or different things like that, or how do we better fulfill the thing that we're trying to do as an organization, right? For instance, you saw a lot of things related to rainforest management or animal tracking, or using large data sets to identify issues in the world. And a lot of those are programmatic issues that nonprofits care deeply and focus on heavily. So these are areas that nonprofits identify as where they want to be focusing their money and time related to artificial intelligence. And this trend has not changed over that 2-year time period. It's been very consistent. Now to this decision-making process. Are nonprofits using AI? And the answer is about 60% of people think that they need more time with AI before they actually are going to use it. 80% of people believe that they need an ethical framework in place before they start adopting it. And half the people are scared of AI. What's really fascinating about these numbers is that, as we think about the 2019 data to the 2020 data, this information is actually more people are using AI, but a consistent number of people believe there's an ethical framework needed, and actually more people are scared in 2020 than they are in 2019. So we're actually seeing some reverse trends from what we may expect in terms of AI adoption, in the fact that people are using it more, but not necessarily more excited about that. Rather, there are just more tools out there and things they're using with it. So implementation, how are people actually using AI? And I will say that this one is going to definitely dramatically change as we're looking at a 2020 perspective. So this is a little bit dated on this one, but significantly people are using some things that they may not necessarily even know are AI-based things that are in their Gmail or in their Facebook suggestions or Slack box. What we're seeing now is moving into 2020, what we're seeing a lot more is uptick in a lot of other AI-based things. So we're seeing a number of third-party or custom-built AI implementations, seeing a lot more of Salesforce Einstein, Microsoft Power Apps, and a number of the things that are happening there are growing significantly. And then there's just a number of players that are coming in here. We're seeing more AI components coming into all of those sort of items as well. So, what I would say is that we'll see a lot more adoption in the report that's coming out in a month, and we're going to see a lot wider spread of adoption that's coming out in the report in a month, and you'll see a lot of different pieces coming in there. So, how are people implementing it, and what are some of the challenges related to AI? And not surprisingly, the issues related to AI are need for technical support, cost to implement, and skill sets required. As I think of a conference like DataCon LA, there's a number of data scientists and brilliant people working on a number of different AI applications. If there were a way to be able to channel, harness, or focus some of those skill sets and abilities to nonprofit organizations that are in desperate need of this, and really are, in a lot of ways, are just trying to figure out how to navigate the different pathways. Should they be looking at Microsoft Power App to start thinking of an AI solution? Should they be looking at data sets? Should they just be doing predictive analytics and not even be thinking about AI yet? And so, as we have people on this particular call that are listening in here, the thing that I would, if you could take away from this, if you are an AI professional thinking about some of these sort of things, your knowledge is really valuable and needed in the nonprofit sector right now, as you can see that they're trying to figure out, how does AI fit into my organization? Does it? Am I even big enough to be able to think about this? And it's a big barrier to a lot of nonprofits thinking about it. So just something to think about as folks are listening in on this call. Finally, people who make decisions to use AI generally have found it to be valuable. They've seen visible results. They have found that it made their life easier. And specifically in the innovators and early adopters phase, they believe that AI has significantly helped their life and make it easier. And these trends are consistent from 2019 into 2020. We're just seeing that people who are finding appropriate implementations of artificial intelligence are generally finding it to be valuable and have continued to use it. And a lot of times that is very specific applications. I build a chatbot that's going to do a very specific thing that will support what's happening. So, that's the state of findings that we've had from the actual survey itself. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go into what's actually happening in the nonprofit sector. And this is going to be an update of what's been happening in 2020. And we're going to talk through a few different things here. So what's happening in AI in the nonprofit sector? Again, the answer is quite a bit. And from 2019 to 2020, I would say that the number of things that have been happening have accelerated a lot. So, what we're showing here is an overall review of what's happening in the space. And what you'll see in the top is you'll see large tech provider, large nonprofit, tech startup, and small nonprofit. And this is not meant to be comprehensive. This does not have every single piece of information in here, but you'll see that there's a representative sample of various organizations. And then on the left-hand side, you see some focus categories. And one of those categories is fundraising and efficiency. So that's thinking about how do we raise more money or be more efficient in our operations related to AI. And then a few areas that have been really important in 2020 are bias and ethical frameworks, health and safety, awareness and education, and environmental and animal related. And what you'll see here are very important trends that are happening, globally and domestically, thinking about issues related to, bias, whether that's gender or racial, health and safety, think about, police issues, think about COVID, things related to that, just general AI awareness and education, having more people understand AI, what's happening there, what's going on in the space, and environmental, how do we make sure that the wildfires in California and most of the West is there a way that we can track it? Can we use AI as a tool to be able to change some of these things? So what you're seeing here is a review of a number of different organizations doing interesting things in the AI sector. And again, this is not a final version of this. We're probably going to add on about another 15 or so different organizations in here, but just a sample of different people doing a lot of things. And a few takeaways here. One, the large tech players are doing a lot of things related to the AI space. And a lot of the organizations that you're seeing here, and in particular Microsoft, are putting a lot of dollars into getting their technology related to AI into the hands of organizations that are doing good things. Microsoft in general has a very specific approach to it. They're doing AI for Earth, they're doing AI for accessibility, they're doing AI for cultural heritage. And so they're really trying to touch a lot of these major topics that are happening in the world. Second of all, large nonprofits, mostly on a project by project basis, or there's a number of organizations that have specific groups focused on AI related things that are happening here. So, we'll use United Way as an example. They're using AI related chatbots to be able to support their service representatives when they're helping nonprofit organizations, as an example. Partnership on AI is working with a lot of large for-profit entities to try to understand what's happening from an ethical framework perspective in health and safety and some of those sort of things. And then in the tech startup space, a lot of the tech startups that are happening are heavily focused on fundraising, and we're guilty as well, which makes sense, right? The lifeblood of nonprofit sector is in the fundraising space, and so a lot of the things that are happening there are related to the fundraising piece of it. But you're also seeing some really cool things that are coming in. Blue Dot helped predict some of the things that were happening to COVID and some of the things that are happening there. X for Impact is trying to take a social graph of all of the sustainable development goals and create a way to be able to connect organizations with funding and figure out market sizes of different things that are happening there. Bright Hive is creating data trust between governments, nonprofits, and for-profit entities to be able to figure out how to share data between different organizations. So really cool, interesting things that are happening in the tech startup space, but very nascent, I would still say, and heavily fundraising focused. And then finally, in the small nonprofit space, the things that are happening here oftentimes are happening in partnership with one of these other organizations, usually large tech providers, although not exclusively, or they're very focused on core aspects of what the nonprofit world is good at. For instance, Hack Diversity is focused on education, like diverse education, diverse team development. Eco AI is requesting that organizations and companies make pledges and statements to have a more fair and balanced and transparent AI approach. Reboot RX is focused on trying to create cancer-related research and use AI algorithms to be able to predict some of the cancer-related COVID trends that are happening. So A lot of really cool things that are happening in the nonprofit world. These organizations, for the most part, are much younger, or they're smaller nonprofits that have just figured out a smart and interesting way to be able to focus on AI right now. So I'm going to walk through a few more examples here, as we talked about. A few ones that I really think are interesting that are happening. One is the social media abuse. So using AI algorithms to essentially determine specific areas where abusive mentions of racial or ethnic background are affecting people on Twitter, and essentially using that information to identify areas of issue that are essentially aggressive, bias-based, abuse-based information components that are affecting people on Twitter, sharing that data with Twitter and different things, and then going after them and trying to support those populations of people, and also trying to identify the culprits of people who are abusive online to try to reduce some of the issues related to social media. Crisis intervention. Crisis text line is an AI-based chatbot that people can do if they are in crisis, and it channels individuals into situations where they can find an AI-based component or a human component on the back end to talk about things that are happening. And it essentially enables them to take a social worker or someone like that and really multiply out the number of people that they can engage with and support while still having a human connecting with them at an appropriate level. It's kind of like taking the level 1 operator out of part of that process while having some governance on top of that. And then finally, there's been some really cool things around elephant migration populations and poaching to be able to track where elephants are going, what are their migration patterns, how do we identify poachers and issues that are happening with these elephants, and using large data sets to be able to do all that sort of information and things related to it. I believe this last one's in partnership with AI for Earth, Microsoft program, but all of them are very, very cool projects that are happening in the mission-driven space. So examples of people who are doing this, like I mentioned, Microsoft's probably the leader that are happening here, but you're also seeing it from Amazon, Google, even IBM. And then on the nonprofit side, you're seeing Amnesty International, you're seeing AI LA. One of the things we noted here was OpenAI has been doing a lot of mission-driven AI, although in the last year, that's really turned into more of a for-profit entity as they've become more IP-driven and less nonprofit focused. And so here's some other cool examples. On the fundraising side of things, we'll show just a few examples here and talk through a few examples of what's happening here. But this is really focused on, how are we able to raise money better and or how to become more efficient. So the first example is the Futurist Group. And the whole idea here is they're using deep learning to essentially identify patients that have gone through a hospital system and understand their experience to create connections with the foundation and the organization to essentially understand who is the most generous and had a good experience with the hospital to identify those individuals as wanting to be potential donors in the future. And they're doing this with a number of different healthcare organizations and different things related to that. But it's a really fascinating example of deep learning that it used a large data set over a 5-year time period to figure out some of those sort of things. Quick plug for what we're doing. Ours is very operationally focused. So we work with a number of corporate partner fundraisers, as well as major gift officers, and basically say, who do I talk to next? Who haven't I connected with in a while? Do I want to think about this in a geographic way where I want to think, oh, I haven't gone to this city in a while and I want to talk to some folks in this area? Or do I just want to think about, some high value donors that I haven't really reconnected with and just want to send a text message or just want to give them a call or say hello to them, those sort of things. And that's what our Plan My Day algorithm is. It's a machine learning algorithm based on a number of different components in there. And then finally, Wisely. And so what they're doing is a portfolio-based approach, also based on machine learning, where they identify a number of different characteristics for major gift officers to say, again, who should I be thinking about and how much should I be asking these people moving forward? And one of the things that's fascinating about the nonprofit sector that maybe some of the folks on this call didn't know about is there's a lot of data out there about wealth information. For instance, there's Wealth Engine, iWave, Donor Search, Windfall, these organizations that have a lot of information on wealthy individuals. But there's this gap between wealthy individuals and kind of the everyone else component where there's not necessarily a great amount of data. Some of these organizations like Wisely, for instance, are trying to figure out how do we start parsing through some of that data in a machine learning perspective to be able to think through who we should connect with and what we should be talking with them about next. So a few more examples here. Blackbaud recently purchased Reher, which was one of the things that happened in the last 12 to 18 months. Salesforce.org obviously has Einstein, who's doing a number of things in the fundraising space. Microsoft also has D365. Neon's doing some things related to it. Startup examples, I know a few folks are on the call from Boodle. They're doing some really cool stuff around Guidon you should ask them about. We're doing some things, Futures, Why is it Gravity, Fund Metrics, and different things related to that as well. There's a whole plethora of different things. If you have questions about the fundraising space, we can dive into that more. Real quickly, so what's happening in investment trends? Mostly there's some big notable examples of investment trends, right? So up in Toronto, University of Toronto, they did a $100 million donation specifically focused on AI-related technology. The Allen Institute for AI, $125 million organization focused on AI. Reid Hoffman has focused on ethical AI and has done $10 million here. And over the last year, we've seen a number of other things that have happened here. What's been interesting over the last year is a lot of the things have not been AI-specific donations and research items. They have been topics that also have an AI component. So what we're starting to see in some of these situations is AI is just becoming an enabler to other things. For instance, we want to figure out better ways to track COVID, or we want to figure out better ways to track animal populations. And we're using AI as a tool in a toolkit of things. And you're finding that there are large donors that are coming in and doing that. So are organizations themselves actually investing in AI? Well, the answer is yes. And what we're seeing here is large organizations are already investing. We're seeing that smaller and medium organizations are planning on investing in the next year or two, and even smaller ones, some of them are also investing, but also more specifically, they're going to be investing in the next couple of years. Now, again, this is 10 months old at this point, and the data that's coming out from this year is just absolutely further accentuating this information. Large organizations are absolutely already investing or investing within the next year. Medium-sized organizations are thinking about it now or starting to invest in it, and small ones are yes and no on very specific platforms. And that's what's basically happening, and what's going to continue happening in the space. Again, for folks who are well-versed in the artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning space, this is a couple years behind what's happening in the for-profit world and a lot of the other things that are happening here, which is typical in the nonprofit sector. What's interesting, though, is that the nonprofit sector has a very unique bent in a different way, which is to say that some of the things that are really important topics related to AI, for instance, surveillance, data privacy, educational investments, those sort of things, harmful content prevention. The nonprofit world is actually taking a pretty forward-thinking stand and trying to get out ahead of it, which is the role that the nonprofit sector should be taking in some of these sort of situations. How do they become the ethical framework? How do they become the partner who helps think through ways to make it so AI is more transparent, is less biased, and those sort of things? And so we're actually seeing nonprofits stopping projects, slowing projects down, rethinking projects, specifically because they're trying to do things that are more ethical, more transparent, and those sort of things that are going into it. And I think that's a really great role for the nonprofit sector. In the sector itself, some of the things that are happening are, we're going to see more programmatic things, more things related to, and any of the things that I mentioned, right? So environmental, safety and health, harmful content, ethical frameworks. We're seeing more and more of that. I think that's going to continue to accelerate. Giving capacity and AI related to figuring out who's giving, how much they're giving, how much are they willing to give, how likely are they to give, those are going to continue to happen. Routine tasks. I don't think this is specific to nonprofit, but it's important to nonprofit. There's a lot of routine daily tasks that can be automated, reduced, and improved that are going to continue to happen in the nonprofit sector. And they're actually probably more opportunity in the nonprofit sector than other sectors for some of these sort of things because there's so many things happening there. Finally, access and ethics. So access to AI, we're seeing a lot of organizations, AI for all, AI for anyone, hack diversity, that are trying to give a more democratized access to education and information related to AI to be able to accelerate who's doing what and who's thinking about what. And finally, the ethics piece of it. Again, I think the nonprofit world has a huge opportunity to be an ethical voice and to be a restraint and a thoughtful process builder around ethics in AI, and it should be an area where they should play that role, and they should be able to come in and say, hey, have we thought about doing this better, essentially, and not just focused on the data sets we have, but thinking about having committees and organizations and data trusts to be able to really make ethical AI an important part of what's happening in the AI space. So final note, the ethics of AI and the role that nonprofits can play in it, I think, is probably the biggest takeaway that I like to leave everyone with whenever I'm thinking about the state of AI in the nonprofit sector. And what this is showing is a map of people who are afraid of AI, right? Stephen Hawking, all the way to people who want to become a cyborg. And there's a range of voices in here about thinking, where people are in the AI sector and those sort of things. And a lot of times nonprofits are on the more ethical side of things that are happening. How do we take a step back and think through this and identify issues with the things that are happening? And as we continue to have these conversations related to AI and where the world's going to go, and particularly as we're thinking about artificial general intelligence and the things that are happening in this sort of sector, the nonprofit world needs to take a stand and make sure that the things that we're doing are related to sustainable development goals, are transparent, are no more biased than the proceeds that existed before AI, but more transparent than they were before. So let me leave you with that, and then we'll open up here for a few minutes of questions at the end. And that's pretty much it. So opening it up now. And I see, let me get a quick drink of water before I answer this. So I see a question asked. Jared noted some small health tech orgs, nonprofits that are mission driven. Which were those organizations? Well, I actually will go back to that slide and be able to show that one. So in the health sector, so some examples of some mission-driven organizations. Reboot RX is doing AI-related cancer and COVID alignment data. That's a cool one. Civis is doing some really cool things related to that. We're actually building some things related to AI, both in the COVID space and some different things. Blue Dot used AI as a way to be able to track COVID patterns, actually predicted some of the COVID moves along this space. And then slightly larger organizations. Benetech is a nonprofit organization that's accelerating a number of different things in the space. The World Health Organization, Museum of Science, University of Buffalo, Crisis Text Line, Amnesty International are all doing things related to health-based artificial intelligence. Second question here. On the AI-based fundraising tools, do you see more adoption in 2020? And what are the barriers? Absolutely see more adoption. I would say that the biggest trend that I'm seeing in the fundraising tool space is that you're seeing more examples of easier to use things, whether that's low code, no code, SaaS-based platforms. We're seeing more things related to that. Off the shelf, could pick it up tomorrow and do some of those sort of things. The problem with AI is that you need a lot of data to do AI. And for a lot of the fundraising components, the issue isn't the technology. The issue is that the data in the nonprofit sector is not as good or well managed as other sectors. So, you're seeing organizations say, oh, we only need 250 data points to be able to do some sort of AI-based algorithm. That's just not true. Like, that's either somewhere in there, they're pulling data from a lot of different data sources and those sort of things, or they're just doing a basic regression or other predictive analytic model. That's not necessarily AI, some version of data science, but things that are going in there. So yeah, so we're seeing a lot more things, easier to use things, more specific things. The other aspect of it is we're starting to see more organizations pick up things like Salesforce, Einstein Discovery. Microsoft has a number of Power Apps that are doing some really cool things about it. And then Blackbot and Reher are really trying to do a lot of things related to predictive analytics. They haven't quite fully adopted every component of the AI piece of it yet, but they're starting to move into that sector and try to figure out pieces related to it. Next question I have here is, can you recommend corporate donors for nonprofits in AI and blockchain technology, i.e. immutable distributed ledger technology? Corporate donors. So that's an interesting question. Everything related to the corporate donor space of things, if you're thinking about doing something technology-based, find someone who's doing that technology and figure out how to get in front of them. So as I think about AI, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, all of them are doing a ton of things related to it. There are grants in the space. There are applications to be able to partner with them and any of those sort of things. Those would all be really good examples. As I think about the distributed technology side of things, that one's a little bit tougher because a lot of the players in that space are dispersed, smaller, and have fluctuated a lot. But a lot of the money that's coming through there are through the engines that are trading on cryptocurrency. So any of the things that are happening, related to like Coinbase or anything like that, like those might be really good partners of thinking about any of the crypto things. The other aspect of crypto is you're starting to see donations via crypto happening, and figuring out how to take in some of those crypto donations, which there are a whole slew of accounting-based issues potentially there as well. But those are some areas that might be really interesting to think about in terms of corporate partner donations. And then finally, I would say, large foundations that are trying to figure out these sort of topics more, if you have a perspective on it and are able to kind of create those partnerships, those would be some interesting things as well. All right, those are the only 3 questions I have right now. I don't know if, Thomas, you had any other ones that we wanted to add in here. If not, I'm happy to give everyone a couple minutes of their day back.
Okay, thank you, Jared. I think that will be all the questions. Thank you for your contribution to these sessions and to the Data Connect. And have an awesome rest of your day.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. And I'll leave this up for the next minute or two. Feel free to follow us on Twitter @PwrdBy or shoot me an email at jared@PwrdBy.com. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jared.